Imagine that human excrement frozen to your boots was the least of your concerns. Inside a typical Viking dwelling, dating back to 982 AD, approximately 37 souls huddled in a space comparable to a modern garage. The floor of this dwelling was a vile concoction of animal manure, rotting food scraps, and human feces, left undisturbed for half a year. The stench assailed anyone who dared to enter like a thick physical wall, so tangible it could literally be tasted. This odor was so unbearable that even hardened warriors couldn't help but vomit the moment they crossed the threshold. But this stench wasn't just repulsive, it actively threatened life, spreading deadly diseases that claimed the lives of half of all Viking children before they reached their 5th birthday. In this cramped space, 37 people, men, women, children, elders, and slaves, resided constantly alongside 12 pigs, 8 goats, and 23 chickens. Separate rooms were non-existent. People ate, slept, fought, gave birth, and died in the very same area where animals lived and food supplies were stored. The walls, constructed of wood and clay, constantly leaked moisture, forming puddles of icy water mixed with urine that never dried. The temperature inside this dwelling rarely rose above 43 degrees 6 degrees, even during summer months. In winter, it plummeted to 26 degrees 3 degrees, and people literally froze to death in their sleep. The only source of heat was a central fire, but its smoke had no other exit than a small, inadequate hole in the roof. As a result, all inhabitants lived in a perpetual cloud of wood smoke, so thick it stung their eyes and caused them to cough up blood. This smoke was so pervasive that by age 20, many had developed irreversible respiratory damage. Breakfast typically consisted of fermented fish buried in the ground for 3 months, mixed with barley that was half mold, half grain. The fish was so putrid that it glowed in the dark due to bacterial activity. However, eating rotten food was common, as fresh produce was nearly impossible to preserve. Vikings regularly suffered from food poisoning, but they had no choice but to eat spoiled meat or starve. Every drop of water teemed with intestinal parasites, causing chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and bloody stools. Vikings were so accustomed to illness that constant diarrhea was considered a normal state of health. Children who survived their first year developed an immunity to parasites that would kill a modern human in a matter of days. People slept on the floor, using animal skins infested with fleas, lice, and mites. Animals slept alongside humans for warmth, meaning waking up covered in pig feces and chicken droppings. Everyone slept in their clothes because undressing meant freezing to death. The same clothes were therefore worn for months without washing. Vikings wore unwashed wool, leather still adhering to rotting flesh, and fur that housed thousands of parasites. Their clothing was so filthy it could stand on its own when removed. Everyone constantly scratched their lice, flea, and scabies-induced wounds until they bled. The itching was so intense that people clawed at their skin to the flesh, leading to infections that were often fatal. Everyone could see, hear, and smell everything others did, 24 hours a day. When someone had diarrhea, which was constant, everyone in the dwelling immediately knew. When couples engaged in sexual activity, which they did regardless of who was watching, it happened in front of children, grandparents, and strangers. When someone died, which occurred frequently, the body remained in the dwelling for several days until the ground thawed enough for burial. An outdoor pit, shared by all villagers, served as a toilet. In winter, the pit froze solid, so people relieved themselves wherever they could, usually inside the dwelling. Human waste accumulated in corners and remained there until spring, when it could be shoveled out. The stench was so overwhelming that visitors often fainted, but Vikings had lost their sense of smell from constant exposure to ammonia fumes. Viking men resolved any disagreements with weapons, and deadly fights regularly occurred inside the dwelling. Blood on the walls was a common decoration, Children watched adults kill each other over insults, disputes about food, or sleeping spots. Women were considered property, beaten, raped, and traded like animals. A typical dwelling experienced at least one murder per month, usually with axes, knives, or bare hands. Slaves, comprising 30% of the population, were beaten daily and forced to work until they died of exhaustion. Free Vikings could kill slaves without consequence, and dead slaves were fed to pigs. Children learned to fight by practicing on slaves, and beating a slave to death was considered a normal stage of a child's development. Viking life, contrary to romanticized notions, was a harsh struggle for survival, overshadowed by disease, unsanitary conditions, and violence, which had a devastating impact on child development. Tuberculosis, that insidious disease, claimed the lives of 40% of Vikings before they reached the age of 30. Dysentery, caused by unsanitary conditions, left people agonizingly wasting away to death within weeks. Skin diseases, born of a lack of hygiene, led to flesh rotting on the bodies of still living individuals. In conditions where isolation was impossible, one community member's illness meant everyone was infected. Viking teeth began to rot by the age of 25 due to the consumption of fermented, moldy food and a complete lack of oral hygiene knowledge. Most adults retained fewer than 10 teeth, which had turned into black stumps, causing constant pain. Dental abscesses were frequently a cause of death when the infection spread to the brain. Children lost their teeth even before permanent ones emerged, depriving them of the ability to chew solid food necessary for proper development. Mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia were attributed by Vikings to the machinations of evil spirits. In attempts to cast out demons, they subjected the mentally ill to brutal beatings with sticks. Those unable to cope with the stress of living in harsh conditions were left to die in the wilderness. Suicide was common, especially among women forced into marriage and pregnancy before the age of 14. There were no weekends, holidays, sick days, or pensions. People toiled until death, which usually came from exhaustion, injury, or disease. Typically before the age of 40, children began working as early as 5 years old, and by 10 they were expected to perform adult-level labor. Food preparation was a nightmare due to contamination and spoilage. Vikings consumed meat that had already begun to rot, as preserving fresh meat was virtually impossible. During periods of food scarcity, they ate insects, tree bark, and grass. Food was cooked in pots that went uncleaned and unwashed for years. The cooking fire was also used for burning human waste, so food acquired the taste of smoke and excrement. The air, in addition to constant wood smoke, was saturated with methane from human and animal waste, ammonia fumes from urine, and hydrogen sulfide from rotting food. This toxic mixture created a poisonous atmosphere that caused headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems. Modern humans would require gas masks to survive in such conditions. Almost half of Viking women, 47%, died during or immediately after childbirth due to malnutrition, disease, and a complete lack of medical knowledge. Newborns entered the world in the same unsanitary conditions that killed adults, and 60% of children died before reaching 5 years of age. Women were expected to return to work the same day after childbirth, regardless of complications, bleeding, or infections. In the event of an insult, trial by combat was common practice. Vikings believed that the gods resolved disputes through battle, so the survivor was automatically deemed in the right. Legal cases were settled with axes, swords, and clubs until one party died. Water was scarce and polluted year-round. Vikings drew water from streams, wells, and rain collectors, all contaminated with animal carcasses, human waste, and industrial runoff from metalworking. The water was brown, thick with sediment, and had a sulfuric taste. Boiling water was not known as a purification method, so people drank raw water and wondered at their constant stomach problems. In the tanning process, Human urine and animal brains were used, resulting in clothing constantly permeated with biological fluids. Leather garments became rock hard when dry and cut into the skin like sandpaper. Everyone had constant scars and open wounds from their own clothing. Trade and economy were controlled by the strong and aggressive. Vikings had no money in the modern sense. They traded stolen goods, slaves, and raw materials. Most economic disputes were resolved through raids, murder, and kidnapping. A successful businessman was one who could kill his competitors and steal their property while avoiding his own demise. Most people went months without washing, and when they did, it was in the same contaminated water they drank. Soap did not exist, so people tried to clean themselves with sand, ash, and urine. Their hair was matted with grease, blood, and parasites, forming permanent dreadlocks. Religious rites included regular human sacrifices and ritual violence. Vikings believed their gods demanded bloody offerings, so they regularly killed slaves, captives, and volunteers in horrifying ceremonies. Sacrifices occurred inside or near the home, so everyone lived surrounded by human skulls, bones, and blood stains. Children grew up watching people tortured to death as part of normal religious practices. Medical treatment was based on superstition and usually only worsened injuries. Vikings believed diseases were caused by evil spirits, so their treatment involved beating sick people, cauterizing them with hot irons, or drilling holes in their skulls to release demons. Operations were performed with dirty knives and without anesthesia. Most medical procedures killed the patient faster than the disease itself would have. Disease itself would have been more terrifying than any enemy. Their music glorified murder, rape, and war, and stories heroicized violence, instilling in children that taking a life was the highest achievement. There were no books, no art, no peaceful pursuits. Girls were married at 12 to 13 years old to strangers, often much older. Wedding ceremonies included a display of the husband's power through public beating or rape of the bride. Divorce was available only to men and often ended in the murder of the woman to prevent her remarriage. A successful Viking was one who had killed the most people and stolen the most property. Their entire economy was built on worsening the lives of others. The combination of poisoned air, filthy water, a brutal social structure, and exposure to diseases unfamiliar to the immune system would have killed an outsider in a matter of hours. Even if one managed to survive the physical suffering, the psychological trauma of constant violence, the smell of decomposing corpses, and living in conditions worse than modern prisons would drive one insane before dawn. Summer brought swarms of flies, mosquitoes, and other biting insects that covered every corner of the dwelling. Insects laid eggs in rotting food, human waste, and the open wounds that covered everyone. Maggots constantly crawled throughout the house, and Vikings ate them because protein is protein. Insect bites caused infections that regularly killed people, and there was no escape from this buzzing, biting cloud that filled the air from dawn to dusk. In winter, the Longhouse became an icy tomb where people froze to death while still breathing. Ice formed on the inner walls from frozen breath, and clothes froze to bodies overnight. Animals died from the cold, and their frozen carcasses remained inside the house because the ground was too hard to dig graves. Vikings burned furniture, tools, and even clothing to keep warm, but the heat did not extend beyond 3 feet from the fire. Hierarchy determined who would sleep closest to the fire and, therefore, survive. The strongest Vikings claimed the warmest spots, while slaves and children were forced to sleep by the walls where temperatures dropped below freezing. People fought fiercely for places by the fire, and the losers died of hypothermia, just a few feet from those who survived the night. When food ran out, which happened every winter, Vikings ate leather, tree bark, and anything they could chew. They boiled bones repeatedly until they crumbled into powder and ate that powder. Cannibalism was not uncommon during the worst famines, and parents sometimes ate their own children to survive until spring. Meat was preserved by burying it in the ground or hanging it from the roof, where it slowly rotted for months. It became moldy, teeming with maggots, and green with decomposition, but eating rotten meat was better than starving. Grain was stored in baskets infested with rats, mice, and insects. Every meal included rodent droppings and insect parts. Rainwater was collected in wooden barrels that were never cleaned and contained algae, bacteria, and dead animals. The water turned green and slimy within days, but it was still drunk because dehydration killed faster than poisoning. In winter, snow and ice, contaminated with animal urine and human waste from the surroundings, were melted for water. Knives, axes, and agricultural tools were never cleaned because soap did not exist and water was too precious to waste on cleaning. Every tool was contaminated with bacteria from previous use, so even small cuts led to infections, amputation, or death. Tetanus from dirty tools killed strong adult Vikings in a matter of days. Pots were never glazed or properly fired, so they absorbed everything cooked in them over many years. Accumulated bacteria, grease, and food residue turned the pots into toxic breeding grounds for disease. Every meal was contaminated by the cookware itself. Leather goods were tanned by soaking animal hides in human urine for several weeks. This process created leather constantly permeated with ammonia and other toxic chemicals. Vikings wore this chemically treated leather directly against their bodies, causing chemical burns, rashes, and permanent scars. The leather never stopped smelling of concentrated urine, and the odor intensified when wet. The Longhouse floor was not merely dirty, it was archaeologically layered with decades of accumulated filth. Archaeologists have discovered Longhouse floors with 7 distinct layers of compacted human waste, animal bones, rotting food, and other debris. Each layer represented years of daily life, and the floor was, in essence, a compressed monument to human suffering. Walking on the floor meant walking on the decomposed remains of everything that had lived and died in that place. Inside these dwellings, the atmosphere was far from cozy or comfortable. The absence of windows, due to the unavailability of glass, condemned Vikings to live in perpetual gloom, where the central fire served as the only light source. Its dim, flickering flame cast eerie shadows, concealing most of the interior in impenetrable darkness. The inhabitants of the Longhouse were constantly in a state of uncertainty, unable to spot danger or obstacles in time until they were in close proximity. Smoke from the fire, an inevitable companion of Longhouse life, caused coughing, wheezing, and choking fits. Children cried incessantly from hunger, cold, and pain, while adults groaned from wounds, fractures, and chronic illnesses. Adding to this oppressive backdrop were the constant noises made by domestic animals, pigs squealing, chickens clucking, and goats bleating. This cacophonous din deprived people of sleep and drove them to despair, pushing them to violence in an attempt to find even momentary silence. Metalworking, carried out directly within the Longhouse, further exacerbated the already unfavorable atmosphere. The forge, necessary for crafting metal tools, filled the air with poisonous fumes. Vikings smelted iron and other metals using fires that released carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and other toxic substances, leading to brain damage, organ failure, and death. Metalworkers, constantly exposed to these harmful substances, suffered from irreversible respiratory diseases and died at a young age. However, they had no choice, as metal tools were vital for survival. Wool spinning, another activity performed inside the Longhouse, also posed health risks. Spinning wheels used to make thread were contaminated with grease, blood, and bacteria from unwashed hands. Looms, used to weave fabric, were never cleaned and housed colonies of insects and parasites. Finished textiles were immediately infested with these same disease-carrying parasites. Human waste was collected in pots, which were thrown outside when overflowing. Since the pots were enormous and people constantly suffered from diarrhea, this did not happen frequently. Waste accumulated around the Longhouse, attracting rats, flies, and other disease vectors. In winter, the waste froze into solid piles that thawed in spring, creating toxic runoff that contaminated everything around. Women gave birth on the same dirty floor where animals lived, and people relieved themselves. The absence of medical instruments, sanitation, pain relief, and understanding of infections meant that women often died from blood loss, infections, or complications that are easily treatable today. Infants were born into such a toxic environment that their chances of reaching adulthood were extremely low. From the age of 5, children were forced to work in dangerous conditions, handling sharp tools, dangerous animals, and toxic materials. Infant mortality was so high that parents did not name their children until they were several years old, believing it was bad luck to name a child who was likely to die. Elderly individuals who lost the ability to work became a burden on the community. They were allocated less food, worse sleeping spots, and denied medical care. Many elderly people died from neglect, hypothermia, or were simply abandoned to their fate during harsh winters. Some elderly Vikings committed suicide, preferring death to another winter of slow starvation and cold. Vikings had no immunity to diseases from other parts of Europe. Trading expeditions often returned with plagues that wiped out entire families. The lack of quarantine led to the immediate spread of illnesses within the confined spaces of the Longhouse. Raiding parties brought back traumatized slaves who often carried diseases and psychological wounds that made them dangerous. Recently captured slaves frequently attempted to escape, committed suicide, or attacked their captors. The Longhouse was constantly confronted with the chaos of broken people torn from their homes and forced to live in horrifying conditions. Spring thaws and heavy rains caused rivers to overflow, flooding longhouses with contaminated water containing human waste, animal carcasses, and toxic runoff. Vikings had to live in these flooded conditions as they had nowhere else to go. The floods created ideal breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and bacteria. The central fire pit was surrounded by flammable materials, wooden walls, animal hides, stored grain, and human hair. House fires were common and typically fatal, as there were no escape routes and no effective ways to combat the blaze. When a longhouse caught fire, everyone inside usually perished from smoke inhalation or burns. Viking longhouses were constructed from any available materials, including rotting wood, mud mixed with human waste, and stones used as grave markers. These building materials constantly released particles into the air people breathed, and the structural integrity was so poor that walls and roofs regularly collapsed, burying people beneath them. During the Viking Age, life was steeped in brutality and violence that permeated every aspect of their existence, like a heavy stench enveloping the settlements. Norse warriors were compelled to witness and participate in ritual sacrifices, public executions, and other bloody entertainments that were commonplace at the time. Even children were not spared this horror, as they were forced to observe these atrocities as part of their upbringing. Refusal to participate in such events was considered a sign of weakness and could lead to severe punishment, including exile or death. However, this way of life was not a conscious choice for the Vikings. Rather, it represented the harsh conditions of survival in medieval Scandinavia, where only the most adaptable could endure the immense challenges. What is commonly referred to as Viking culture was, in reality, merely a thin veneer covering deep despair and fear of a merciless reality. The people who managed to survive in this environment were those who could adapt to conditions that, by modern standards, would be considered genuine torture. A modern person transported to that era would likely not survive a single day. The very first breath of stale air in a Viking dwelling could lead to respiratory problems. A single step on the filthy floor would risk parasitic infections that would slowly but surely erode one's health. and just one look at the living conditions would be enough to cause profound psychological trauma requiring extensive therapy. Most likely, an unprepared time traveler would not last even 24 minutes, let alone a full day, in the harsh reality of the Viking world.